January 26, 1942. The docks of Belfast lay wrapped in winter fog, the kind that clung to brick warehouses and made the River Lagan disappear into grey nothingness. The air tasted of coal smoke and salt, and the cobblestones gleamed black with morning dew. Along the quays, British soldiers stood in their weathered uniforms, collars turned up against the cold, watching the troop ships glide through the mist like iron ghosts. Then the first Americans came down the gangplanks, and everything the British thought they knew about their Atlantic ally began to shift. They came in waves, these young men from places called Iowa and Texas and California, places that seemed as distant as the moon to the war-weary citizens of Northern Ireland. The British soldiers watched them with eyes that had seen Dunkirk, that had lived through the Blitz, that carried the weight of 3 years of total war. What they saw that morning would become the subject of countless letters home, official reports, and private conversations that revealed something deeper than mere military assessment. They were witnessing the arrival of a different kind of power, one that would reshape not just the war, but the very balance of the world to come. The British reaction was immediate and complex, recorded in documents that still exist in archives across the United Kingdom. Astonishment came first. The American soldiers seemed impossibly well fed in a land where rationing had reduced the British diet to a grim mathematics of calories and coupons. The Americans stood taller, their cheeks fuller, their teeth straighter and whiter than seemed natural to people who had endured years of dietary restrictions. One British officer wrote in his diary that the Americans looked like they had stepped out of a cinema screen, healthy and confident in a way that seemed almost fictional. But it was the equipment that truly stunned the British observers. Where British units made do with aging rifles and patched uniforms, the Americans arrived with brand new M1 Garand rifles, steel helmets that shone despite the voyage, and boots that appeared to have never touched ground before that morning. The supplies seemed endless. Crates of equipment filled the docks, stacked higher than seemed reasonable, containing goods both military and personal that spoke of an industrial capacity the British had forgotten existed in a world at war. The contrast cut deep because Britain in 1942 stood exhausted. The island nation had fought alone for 2 years after the fall of France, had weathered the systematic bombing of its cities, had sent its young men to die in the deserts of North Africa and the skies over Germany. The British people had stripped their parks of iron railings to feed the war machine, had dug up flower gardens to plant potatoes, had learned to live in darkness and cold and constant fear. Every resource had been bent towards survival, and survival had cost them dearly. Then came these Americans, citizens of a nation that had entered the war only weeks before, carrying with them the wealth of an untouched continent. The British watched them unload not just weapons, but luxuries that seemed obscene in wartime. There were stories, perhaps embellished but widely believed, of American quartermasters distributing fresh oranges and white bread and real coffee, items that had become semi-mythical in Britain. The Americans seemed to travel with their entire civilization in tow, as if abundance itself were part of their military doctrine. The British response mixed gratitude with something harder to name. Relief came in waves because the Americans represented salvation, the mathematical certainty that Germany could not win against the combined industrial might of the British Empire and the United States. But alongside relief came a kind of mourning because the arrival of these well-supplied troops marked the moment when Britain ceased to be the dominant partner in its own survival. The empire that had ruled a quarter of the world was now dependent on the generosity and power of a former colony. Official British assessments from early 1942 reveal this tension in careful bureaucratic language. Military reports praised American enthusiasm while noting concerns about combat inexperience. The Americans were keen but untested, brave but untrained in the specific horrors of modern warfare. British officers worried privately about how these confident young men would fare when the real killing began, when the cinematic shine wore off and the mud and blood and exhaustion of combat became reality. The cultural clash was immediate and profound. The Americans brought with them customs that seemed brash to British sensibilities. They were louder, more informal, less respectful of class distinctions that the British considered natural as weather. American enlisted men spoke to officers with a familiarity that shocked British soldiers trained to observe strict hierarchies. The Americans chewed gum, a habit the British found simultaneously fascinating and vulgar. They played music at volumes that seemed designed to announce their presence to the entire island. And they had money. American soldiers drew pay that dwarfed British wages, and they spent it freely in pubs and shops across Northern Ireland. This created immediate social friction as local women found American soldiers more attractive partners, not just for their exotic accents and easy confidence, but for their ability to provide small luxuries that British men simply could not afford. The phrase that emerged, whispered and resented, was that the Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. But beneath the resentment lay recognition. The British military establishment understood what the arrival of American forces meant in strategic terms. Germany had failed to invade Britain in 1940, had failed to bomb the nation into submission in 1941, but the road to victory still seemed impossibly long and costly. British planners knew that defeating Germany would require invading the European continent, would demand an amphibious assault of staggering complexity and risk. Such an operation needed resources that Britain no longer possessed alone. The Americans brought those resources. They brought the capacity to produce ships and planes and tanks in quantities that staggered the imagination, to feed and equip armies of millions, to project power across oceans. British officers touring American supply depots in Northern Ireland filed reports that read like catalogues of industrial miracles. The scale of American logistics seemed to operate under different laws of economics and production than anything the British had known. This realization transformed British strategic thinking in the months following January 1942. The war would be won not through British grit and German mistakes, but through American industrial supremacy. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh and Los Angeles would produce victory, would bury the Axis powers under waves of steel and aluminum and rubber. Britain's role was shifting from leader to partner, from empire to ally dependent on a rising power. The transformation showed in small moments recorded by ordinary British soldiers and civilians. A British sergeant wrote to his wife about sharing tea with American soldiers who seemed genuinely puzzled by the concept of rationing, who could not comprehend a world where sugar and butter and meat were precious commodities distributed by government decree. The Americans spoke of shortages back home, of rubber drives and scrap metal collections, but these seemed like civic exercises rather than existential necessities. America was playing at sacrifice while Britain lived it. Yet the British also recognized something admirable in the American approach to war. The Americans brought an optimism that seemed almost childlike but proved strangely infectious. They believed problems could be solved through effort and ingenuity, that enough resources properly applied could overcome any obstacle. This was not the fatalistic courage of British soldiers who had learned to endure, but something different, a confidence born of never having experienced national defeat or occupation or sustained bombardment of civilian populations. The Americans believed they would win because America always won, because their history was a story of expansion and success and manifest destiny. The British, with their longer memory of empires rising and falling, their intimate knowledge of how great powers declined, found this optimism both naive and necessary. Perhaps wars were won by nations that still believed in their own invincibility, that had not yet learned the lessons of limits and loss. British civilians in Northern Ireland experienced the American presence in immediate and personal ways. The local economy transformed almost overnight as American purchasing power flooded into communities that had known only wartime scarcity. Pubs that had served watered beer suddenly found American soldiers willing to pay premium prices for any alcohol at all. Shops sold out of goods the moment they appeared on shelves, snapped up by Americans who seemed immune to the careful rationing mentality that governed British consumer behavior. This created real hardship for British families who found themselves priced out of their own markets, who watched local girls dance with American soldiers at dances, British men could barely afford to attend. The resentment was real and justified, and complicated by the knowledge that these same Americans might soon be dying for British freedom, might be sacrificing themselves to liberate a continent from fascism. The British press handled the American arrival with careful diplomacy, emphasizing the unity of Anglo-American friendship while mostly avoiding the tensions and contradictions that filled private conversations. Newsreels showed smiling American soldiers, shaking hands with grateful British civilians, constructing a narrative of seamless alliance. The reality was messier, full of cultural misunderstandings and jealousies, and the painful adjustment of a proud nation learning to accept junior status in a partnership it had once expected to dominate. Military cooperation revealed the depth of British experience and American inexperience in ways that gave the British some satisfaction. When American units began training exercises in the Northern Irish countryside, British observers noted deficiencies that would need correcting before these troops could face German veterans. The Americans learned quickly, their officers eager to absorb lessons paid for in British blood over 3 years of war. But the learning process confirmed what both sides understood. The Americans had the resources, but the British had the knowledge bought through suffering. The transformation of Britain's relationship with America accelerated through 1942 and beyond, as more American troops arrived, as the build-up for eventual invasion grew. Northern Ireland became a vast military staging ground, American bases spreading across the landscape, American vehicles clogging the narrow roads, American voices filling the air. The British watched their country being transformed into a forward operating base for American power, understood that they were witnessing the pivot point of global dominance shifting across the Atlantic. Some British observers saw this clearly in 1942, wrote in private letters and diaries about the end of the British century and the beginning of the American one. They understood that the war, regardless of its outcome, had already decided the question of which nation would lead the post-war world. Britain would survive, would claim its place among the victors, but would never again command the unquestioned supremacy it had known before 1914. The American soldiers in Northern Ireland were mostly unaware of these larger currents. They trained and drank and courted local girls and complained about the weather and the food and the strange British customs. They carried with them an unself-conscious power, the casual confidence of a nation that had never doubted its own strength or questioned its ultimate triumph. To British eyes, this confidence seemed both admirable and slightly absurd, the certainty of children who had not yet learned that the world could break you. But the British also recognized that perhaps this unbroken confidence was exactly what would win the war, what would drive the industrial production and military offensives needed to crush the Axis powers. The tired British soldier, who had fought since 1939, looked at the fresh-faced American recruit and saw both salvation and replacement, the future arriving to take over from an exhausted past. The documents and letters from this period reveal British observers struggling to articulate what they were witnessing. They used words like impressive and overwhelming and sometimes excessive, trying to capture the sheer scale of American mobilization. They noted the waste, the seemingly careless abundance that offended British sensibilities trained to conserve and reuse and make do. But they also noted the results, the capacity to simply overwhelm problems through the application of unlimited resources. This approach to war violated every principle of British military tradition, which emphasized efficiency and clever use of limited means. The Americans seemed to believe that no amount of material could be too much, that victory came through crushing superiority in every category of supply and equipment. To the British, this seemed wasteful. To the Americans, it seemed like common sense. Why fight fair when you could fight from a position of overwhelming advantage? The ideological implications of these different approaches extended far beyond military tactics. They represented fundamentally different visions of how societies should organize themselves, how economies should function, how freedom itself should be understood. The British system, even before the war, had accepted certain limitations as natural and proper. Class boundaries, resource constraints, and the necessity of rationing opportunity and reward across the population seemed like basic social facts. The Americans brought a different philosophy, one that assumed abundance rather than scarcity as the natural state of affairs, that believed expansion and growth could solve most problems, that rejected the fixed hierarchies of European society in favor of a more fluid and democratic ordering. The British watching American soldiers in 1942 were not just observing military allies, but encountering a rival ideology, one that would challenge and eventually supplant their own vision of how the world should work. The irony was not lost on more thoughtful British observers. They were fighting to preserve freedom and democracy against fascist tyranny, and in the process becoming dependent on a power that would use that dependence to reshape the global order according to American principles. The war would preserve British political independence but cost Britain its economic and strategic autonomy, would save the nation but not the empire, would secure freedom but transfer the definition of freedom from British to American control. Standing on those Belfast docks in January 1942, British soldiers could not have fully understood all these implications, could not have foreseen the complete arc of decline that would follow victory. But they sensed something fundamental shifting, felt in their bones that the arrival of these impossibly well-fed American troops marked a turning point not just in the war, but in the larger story of their nation's place in the world. What Britain said when they first saw American troops in Northern Ireland was complex and contradictory, a mixture of relief and resentment, gratitude and grief, hope and mourning. They said it in official reports that praised American resources while questioning American experience. They said it in private letters that marveled at American abundance while resenting American display. They said it in pub conversations that welcomed American allies while resenting American rivals for the attention of local women. They said it in the careful diplomatic language of politicians maintaining necessary alliances while watching their nation's global dominance slip away. The epilogue to this moment played out over decades, not months, as the implications of American entry into the war became clear. Britain would survive, would participate in victory, would maintain its pride in institutions and identity. But the world Britain had dominated for a century was gone, replaced by an American order that valued different things, that measured success in different terms, that understood freedom as abundance rather than duty, as opportunity rather than obligation. The young men who came off those ships in Belfast carried with them the future of the world, though they did not know it and would not have believed it if told. They carried a vision of human possibility rooted in material prosperity, in the idea that enough production could solve any problem, that scarcity was a choice rather than a fate, that freedom meant the ability to consume and create and remake yourself without reference to ancient hierarchies or fixed limits. This vision would triumph, would reshape not just the post-war settlement, but the dreams and aspirations of people around the world. The British model of ordered scarcity, of knowing your place and making do with less, of finding dignity in endurance and restraint, would fade before the American promise of abundance for all, of social mobility and material comfort as birthright rather than privilege. The price of this transformation was the thing Britain gave up that morning in January 1942 when the first American soldier stepped onto the Belfast docks. It was not territory or treasure, not military power or economic dominance, though Britain lost all these things. It was something less tangible, but more fundamental. The certainty that the British way of organising society, British values and British vision represented the highest achievement of civilization and the natural model for the world to follow. That certainty died in Northern Ireland in early 1942, died slowly and painfully as the British watched themselves become junior partners to a nation they had once considered provincial and crude. And in its place grew something new, an understanding that history did not stop with empire, that the future belonged to powers and peoples and ideas not yet fully formed, that freedom itself was not a fixed concept, but something that each generation would redefine according to its own dreams and capacities. The Americans came to Northern Ireland to help save Britain from fascism, and they succeeded, but in saving Britain, They changed it forever, replaced it at the center of the world with something bigger and brasher and more confident, something that believed scarcity was optional and abundance was destiny, that freedom meant not the right to endure but the right to flourish, not the dignity of limits but the glory of endless possibility. What Britain said that morning was goodbye, though they did not yet have words for it. Goodbye to an age of empire and certainty. Goodbye to dominance and the assumption of natural superiority. And in that goodbye was also a recognition, painful but true, that what was ending deserved to end, that the world the Americans promised, for all its flaws and contradictions, represented something closer to human freedom than the ordered hierarchies Britain had perfected and exported across the globe. The docks of Belfast on that foggy January morning became the stage for this transformation, the place where two visions of freedom met and merged and began the long process of creating something new. The British soldiers watching from the quays, cold and tired and grateful and afraid, witnessed not just the arrival of allies but the arrival of the future itself, stepping off troopships into the grey light of a winter dawn, carrying with it the promise and peril of a world remade by American abundance and American dreams.